Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. If you watch my video on replacing a fuel tank in a 1967 Corvette, you'll notice at the end that fuel was pouring out of the carburetor. Carburetor too. Since I didn't have enough time on that trip or couldn't find a carb kit locally, I went ahead and ordered one and I brought the carburetor back with me. So we're gonna take that carburetor apart and clean it out here on the bench. Here's the victim. It is a Holley, I don't know if you can see that, list 3367 carburetor, which should be the original carburetor for that car, and a Holley carburetor kit 37119. Everything I looked up said that this was the right kit for this carburetor. I also have this book that I think I got used on eBay a couple years ago. The intention was to put a Holley carburetor on my truck at some point, but it was kind of hard to find the right CFM, so I ended up with an Edelbrock, which actually works fine at this point, but it has all kinds of stuff in here. You can tell it's been around a while. Also a sign of the times. It used to be, to me, in my mind, a carburetor kit should cost about 15 bucks. This was like 35, and I saw them higher than that. And again, they didn't used to cause cancer and reproductive harm. But I don't know if that's only if you're in California, so I think we're probably safe. So this kit comes sealed like this, and as soon as you open it, if it's the wrong one, you're screwed. You bought it anyway. The main problem we experienced with this was the last time I'd driven it, it acted like the transition slots in the carburetor were screwed up or clogged. So I wanted to at least clean the junk out of the carb float bowl. When I took it off, the cork gasket in there completely disintegrated into like dust. So I made a gasket to solve that problem, which actually worked, but then fuel poured out of the accelerator pump. So really the only problem is a homemade gasket for the float bowl and the accelerator pump diaphragm. But I might as well clean it all out. This is the fuel inlet. So all the fuel comes into this float bowl, and then there's a tube that transfers it to the rear float bowl. But we'll start by getting the bowl off. When it turned out that a carburetor kit wasn't going to happen that day, we just bought a sheet of gasket material and I cut that out to make it work, which it apparently did. I'm not going to mess too much with the float and needle valve. All that stuff worked. So when the float is low like that, fuel comes in, it pushes this plunger off, it shuts off the float level. So I'm going to assume all that's okay. While we're here, I'll go ahead and pull off this and look at the diaphragm. That's taking way too long. Thing as hard as a rock. I'd say it probably ate through right in that vicinity. So this float bowl in the back is for the secondaries. So normally, under normal driving, you'd be operating on the front two barrels. So you would drive, you'd slam open the primaries. It would allow it would cause the manifold vacuum to drop, which would pull open the secondary throttle plates and allow fuel from the rear from the secondaries, from this rear flow bowl, that's where the fuel for it would come from. And this tube right here is how the fuel gets to the back, and there's an O-ring on each end. And in my experience, they're prone to leaks, so you have to be careful of those too. Whew. And it smells really bad in there. There's also gaskets on these screws. Since these screws go all the way through fuel, that's what keeps them from leaking. And it's the same setup on the rear. There's a float that allows fuel into the correct level, and you can see all that junk in there. We're gonna have to clean this real well. We'll clean it real well anyway, but definitely got to get that clean. That's the secondary. I think that's called a metering plate, but don't quote me. I'll find the correct term for that. Let's go back to the front. These are the main jets, I'm assuming. That's what I'm going to call them. That is the jet that meters your fuel going into the primary circuit. And I would guess there's numbers on there somewhere. I certainly can't read them right now. We'll find that here in a minute. This whole deflector comes off. And then this metering plate should come off. So that's technically the metering body, and it should just be held on there with the gasket. I'm resisting the temptation to get in between the cracks there and pry it. You can damage the machine surface. The gasket disintegrating. So there we go. And then that is the power valve assembly. It looks like that gasket's disintegrating too. So, and that should unscrew out of there. So a 1-inch socket fits that. Well, that gasket's not completely destroyed, but it has certainly seen better days also. There should be a new power valve in this kit, I would assume. I want to try to save as much of this gasket as I can, because I'm going to assume that in that kit there's about 15 different ones, and if you block any of these passages, it is not going to be right. No, there's for the most part. On the secondary side, those appear to be clutch head screws. That takes a special screwdriver. You see the shape. Normally a regular screwdriver will fit in there, and we'll see. On the secondaries, there's 2 gaskets. And that's like all mushy. So again, we'll try to get that off there in 1-ish pieces. So they're just calling that the secondary metering plate. Let's Been a while since I've messed with one of these, but there is a metal plate between all of this mess. I'm trying not to bend that up any more than I already have. So that's bent just a little bit right there. We flatten that out before we put it back together. I don't think there's any save in this gasket. Obviously not to reuse, but just to match up the holes. Let's hope they're not too much different. And I guess the only holes that really are important are what goes through the metering plate, which would pretty much be those right there. Let's be careful when we put it back together. And I may be wrong, there may not be a whole bunch of different choices in that kit. So I decided, what the heck, the more I looked at how crusty some of this stuff was. Already in this we have the whole kit. Let's just strip it down the rest of the way. I'll pull the base plate off. Wow, that was not really even tight. Okay, that's loose. And there is there's a little E-clip right here that is the secondary linkage. Get that off there. Try not to lose that. That should allow that to come out of there. And there's the base plate. With all the screws falling out. Let's see what else we have here. So over on this side, this car has what they call a divorce choke. So the choke coil lives down here in the manifold in a little pocket, and that's what pulls on to operate the choke. So when it's cold, that spring's expanded, and then as it gets warm, it pulls it down, opens the choke plate. Another E-clip. And that whole deal should pull off. We can get to that screw behind it. Stick them in there so we don't lose them. That pretty much covers the disassembly of the body. So I figured I went this far. Went ahead and got a can of this Berryman's Chem Dip carburetor parts cleaner. It's got a lot of warnings on it, so it's probably pretty good stuff. I'm sure over the years they've detoxified it a little bit. We'll put the primary metering plate in there. Start with that and see what it does. Stuff doesn't smell as toxic as I would have thought, so we'll let that sit for a while off to the side. Work on cleaning this up. Let's go ahead and open our kit and start finding the right gaskets before we start destroying stuff. No turning back now. That part's not even in there. A float level gauge, various O-ring seals, and that's probably what came out of there. It's like some balls and some clips, needles and seats for the floats, a power valve, a diaphragm for the accelerator pump, and then a whole truckload of gaskets. See what I mean about trying to match them up? And going to soak this down with some of the stuff in a can. We'll let it sit a while, and that might start eating the bond up and let this stuff come off. We'll soak in that well too. So it's the next day. It's a balmy 85 degrees out here. Got everything clean, well as I can get it clean anyway. Blown out with carb cleaner, compressed air, whatever you can blow stuff with. I found a matching gasket for the base plate and lined it up, and it appears to uncover all the holes that need to be uncovered under there, so I'm going to go ahead and get that on there, and then we can start on the rest of it. Alright, that looks right. We'll go to the secondary side and we'll go ahead and get that knocked out. I located the secondary block. I went through the kit, and the closest gasket I found was this one. This hole wasn't knocked out. Upon further inspection, factory didn't knock it out. So that will be next. I had some choices. I chose this one. This was what came out of it. This appears to be the closest match. It's not blocking off any holes. So we'll go with this. This is on the secondary side. Next will be the secondary metering plate, I believe is what it's called. Secondary metering body plate goes on. I'm going to tap this little edge flat. That was in an effort to get it out of there. That's as flat as that thing's going to get, and as clean as it's going to get. So that will go on along with the secondary metering body and another gasket. So after much consternation, I finally settled on this gasket. It's the only one that locates this metering plate correctly. So that will go on such as that. And then the secondary metering plate go on that. And then between the secondary metering plate and the secondary metering block, this all sandwiches together, and that's the one that had the clutch head screwdrivers. And this is the only gasket in the kit, so you can't go wrong there. And that, like I said, was the only one that had little locating holes in it. And then that's where the infamous clutch head screws go in. Anyway, I was a little concerned that this would block off fuel from entering behind here, but the orifices that allow fuel into the secondary metering block from the float bowl go through there. So I left the float bowl off the rear of the carburetor, which would be the secondary side for now, to go on to something I know even less about. That's the front of the carburetor and the primary metering circuit. What I do know is this is the primary metering block. This is where all the magic happens, at least in the primary circuit. That has a gasket, and here's it, that goes between it and the carburetor body. And I've located that, and that only goes on, and now I'm lying, it only goes on one way, such as that. This is the power valve. So apparently when there's extra power needed, this is what gives it to you. The way I understand it, this remains closed until the vacuum drops and the spring is forced this way, opens this valve and allows more fuel in. This one, I don't know if you can see it, I had a hard time seeing it. That diaphragm in there is cracked, or all the rubbers come off of it. The kit comes with a new one. They're supposed to be identified by stampings on the outside. I sure as heck couldn't see anything. The only thing I saw was way down in here. Looks like a 75. I'm going to assume, based on what I've read, you can see maybe the rubber. That's at 7, opens at 7.5 inches of mercury. This one's a 6.5. We're going to go with it. What's one, right? So there's a gasket. and that will screw in right there. And that's where we used our 1-inch socket or wrench. You likely don't need to go like lug nut crazy on this, but just tight is fine. And then that goes on the carburetor body. The jets will go in there, and then we will go with the float bowls. So we're back for another night of carburetor excitement. This is the primary float bowl, float, needle valve, etc. I looked through what came in the kit, and I have several different versions of needle valves, but this carburetor apparently has two different styles. In the primary, it has this style, which has a cap. And it's threaded on both sides, so you come in here and adjust it by turning this nut, and that'll raise and lower the level. And I believe it to be the same. The one in the secondary is different. It has this style, and it actually seems to be working fine, but I don't have a replacement in the kit. I was going to leave both of them because I know the height's adjusted fine. This one is sticking, and I do have the correct style, it appears to be. So I'm going to go ahead and change this one, replace it with a new one. And there's some measurements for float height. We may mess with that, or we may just kind of match that right there. Pulls right off. Of course, that gasket's no good, just like all the rest of them. So now I should be able to back this needle valve out. So we're looking at about 3 threads. That thing should come out of there. So that one's out. Of course, it works fine now that it's out. The new one looks identical, so we'll go identical-ish. I'm going to put a little oil. This is just motor oil on the threads and the O-ring. We'll put that back in. It'll probably go in a lot easier. To me, that's close enough to the same thread amount exposed. Now we'll find the gasket for all this mess, and we'll get that put back in there. There's the gasket. That nut has flats on it that drop on there. And this nut has the plastic seal. We'll just go with that. It should be fine. And you can always adjust this once the car's running. But that's about the height we had before. And there's procedures in the book for measuring that. So now that's all together. That's clean. That's the correct gasket, power valve, etc. We need to put the main jets back in. These are the main jets. I'm assuming there's a number on here somewhere. Sure there is, but it's what came out of it. That's what's going back in. And they will just screw in. Okay. Gasket's in place-ish. We'll go ahead and reseal it. These pins hold it. That'll go in. Power valve's in there. Should be all we have in that. Now, the main reason for all this was the accelerator pump. There's a ball in there. I could pry this out of the way, but that is like a check valve. And that is what, when you press the accelerator pump, press the gas, squeezes that diaphragm, and that shoots fuel through that hole, through this little hole metering block up in, and gives you a little extra squirt of fuel through the squirters so you don't stumble when you accelerate. So you got to make sure that hole is definitely lined up. There's the new diaphragm. There's the old spring. We'll put that back just like it was once we pick it up off the floor. So let me see if I can do this without dropping this again. Jesus Christ. That's how it sits on the carburetor. There's the fuel side of the accelerator pump. And that should go together just like that. And then the arm over here, we'll push down on that and squirt fuel through here into what we just showed you. Which should just pop on there like that. Now, there were gaskets on all these screws. I need to scrape them off and then scrape them off the screws and find the corresponding gasket in the kit, and we can put this front flow bowl back on. I just about forgot this little shield for the vent. Not really sure what that does. So now I think we're out of parts to put in there. This bowl can go on. The new gaskets for the screws are plastic. At least that's the only thing in the kit that fit. So that might be a nice change. We'll get them in there. Put a little oil on the threads just to make sure everything goes in smoothly. I did neglect to clean the portion of this gasket off, which likely wouldn't hurt anything. This would be typically above the fuel line. Let me go ahead. I cleaned the screws off. Missed the gaskets. Oh, missed the hole. So I put O-rings on this fuel supply tube, and I think finally got this vent arm to clear. It was not even close to not missing. If that makes sense. So now we can install the rear flow bowl. Of course, I've had this tube off about 100 times. Put a little more oil on that O-ring. And that should just slide in. Then we'll start the screws again. That rod clears as well as I can get it to clear. And so it just rests on there until you add throttle, and then it goes away from it. So right here in the final hour, I rounded up some 5/16 bolts and nuts and kind of made a stand. Okay, so pretty much the first thing that needs to go on is this, because you can't get to the screw back here. So now those are on. Took this back off, got all this hooked back up. Now I should be able to attach this linkage up. Don't pull it off, because the rod for the choke lever needs to go in this hole back here. So you kind of have to wrestle that thing in. There's no snap ring or anything on that because you'd never get to it anyway. There should be one there, and those should be the two snap rings we have. So now, back to our choke pull off. That goes in that slot, rolls around. Okay, I think that's all right finally. Don't touch anything, and let's get these two screws in. Hold this on. Okay, all that should be right, and I think we are out of parts. So next, are the E-clips. And they are contained in a bag in here, but to be honest, these don't look that bad. I'm just going to pop them back on. Pretty sure the small one came off there. This little cam deal goes on like so. That's how it worked. And that works the function of the choke. So when the choke, when it's cold out, it's going to be long, and as it starts working its way down, that kind of like the fast idle cam. So you step on it and it drops off. Otherwise, depending on the position of the choke coil, it would stop in fast idle till it fully warmed up. So now, what's left? We have this large snap ring. The only place it can go is right there. So I think I'm complete here. All back together, new gaskets, all that functions. Accelerator, pump cam. I'm assuming all that was adjusted properly before, so I'm not going to touch that, and the car ran fine other than bad fuel. I do need to pull out the idle mixture screws. So these screws are used to set the idle mixture. Good practice is to turn half, one, a little over one, and we'll back it out, and then we'll go. There's an O-ring in here. An O-ring which is pretty trashed. Actually, that's that little kind of. So that is probably what seals the idle O-ring for the idle jet. Get that little shot of oil. That's kind of serrated right there, so that should hold that in. Thread that in there through that. We'll back it out half, one, and a little bit more. Do the same thing to the other side. Okay, we'll set that the same. Half, one. Now we should be fully put back together. Unfortunately, that car is 450 miles away, so I have no way to put it on the car and test it. So I have some options. I think I'll just, next time I see my mother, I'll send it back with her. And I did a little cell phone video of everything I unhooked, so she should be able to hook this back up and get it to run. Left the floats essentially the same, idle mixture screws the same, just cleaned everything out. I think it'll run fine. I could possibly put this on my truck and run it, but that engine's pretty tired and a little smaller. Plus I don't have the linkage to hook up for my transmission TV cable. I have an Edelbrock on there now. So, I don't know, I'll think about it. So, I pretty much decided to send it as it is. It'd be too much trouble to hook it up on a different engine. And then if we did some tuning on it, it wouldn't be right. So, one thing that stood out to me while I was editing the video was how much different color this front float bowl is. And the reason I believe that is we had to replace this. It seems like one time, or at some point in its life, the threads in here got boogered up. There's a metal filter in there. I don't think I showed that. And they got screwed up, so we had to replace the float bowl. It probably explains why the needle valves for the fuel inlet are different. Anyway, just thought I'd share a couple of those little tidbits. So anyway, thanks for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you soon.